Welcome back to The Full View. We've brought you several voices on this issue throughout the week. A government considering declaring a state of disaster to deal with the power crisis, which of course impacts water, that we've been zooming in on tonight. What are the implications? To discuss, we're now joined by the head of the Northwest University's African Centre for Disaster Studies, Professor Dewald van Niekerk. Professor, thank you for being with us. We posed this question to our viewers yesterday, how they felt about a state of disaster. Many were skeptical after what we experienced during COVID-19. How do you feel?
Good evening, Francis. Yes, I've been quite outspoken the past few days on this issue as well. Now, I was intricately involved in the drafting of the legislation, also of the National Disaster Management Framework. So I do have a history and understanding of the intent of the Disaster Management Act. And for all means and purposes, what the government is now trying to achieve, I don't believe falls within the ambit and the scope and the intent of the Disaster Management Act. The Act is very clear in how it defines a disaster, how it defines a state of disaster at various levels, and also the process that we need to follow in order to declare a national state of disaster, and then obviously the reasons why we would want to do that. Now, we've experienced this through the COVID-19 pandemic. I think all the viewers are quite aware of the far-reaching powers given to government once there is a state of disaster. And it begs the question, why do we need a state of disaster for this particular crisis, given the fact that it doesn't 100% adhere to what the Disaster Management Act aims to achieve, but it also raises, I think, quite a number of red flags in our democracy if we start governing by disasters.
So can you explain why this would not count as a disaster that requires a state of disaster quickly?
So within normal English language, we would talk about a disaster and there's this assumption of an understanding. So we would typically say, well, potholes are a disaster, our local government's a disaster, the energy crisis is a disaster. But a state of disaster is a very specifically defined aspect or phenomenon within the Disaster Management Act. Now, there's one major component to the progression towards a state of disaster, and that is that we might sit with a particular natural or anthropogenic or a human-made hazard. And there's certain characteristics which we can scientifically identify and study when it comes to this phenomenon. Now, the Disaster Management Act particularly tries to instill disaster risk reduction measures. So our Act is quite forward-thinking in the sense that we can declare a state of disaster even before we sit with something that adheres to this definition of a disaster. Now, in the case of the energy crisis, we have to ask ourselves, what is the particular hazard? What is this thing that we are trying to mitigate, and what situation are we trying to rectify by declaring a national state of disaster? And it's not even a grey area. It's an area that I don't think we should even consider when it comes to the Disaster Management Act. Why I'm saying this is the far-reaching power that it gives government normally assumes under a state of disaster that government do not have adequate resources and capacities to deal with the situation. However, if you look at government and the current energy crisis, there's enough resources, there's enough skills, there's enough budget, there's enough processes to be doing this. But since 2007, government has not been this. Now we are approaching an election year. I think the ANC government are finding themselves in an extremely perilous situation where they're now reverting to a process that will give power and basically carte blanche to do quite a number of far-reaching things pertaining to this energy crisis. So in short, the Disaster Management Act, I don't think is the correct legal instrument in this case.
All right, and it may even be challenged, but let's be very clear on what you're saying, because I think as journalists, we should really ask government, is there anything that can be done? Presumably, well, the idea is that maybe it can be done faster, that more money can be released. But you're saying that there's nothing that government can do in a state of disaster around this issue that it couldn't normally do, or that couldn't have been done over the years that we've experienced blackouts.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the reasons that they are citing, procurement procedures. Now, I mean, immediately that should raise a massive red flag for us, because we saw what happened within the COVID pandemic. Now we want to fast-track procurement procedures to do maintenance, to procure certain equipment that we couldn't do. Really, we couldn't do that for since 2007. We want to establish certain committees. They already have an energy crisis committee. All these things are already in place. What I see, and there's an element of the unknown when it comes to the inners of the decision making of the ANC. Why are they choosing or want to choose this particular avenue to manage the situation? There's many ways of giving directives straight to the officials in government and telling them to fast track, cut the red tape and do what you are supposed to do. You don't need a state of disaster to do this. You need political will, you need an ability of ministers and of our top management within government to do what they are supposed to do. And I don't think in this case this is actually happening.
Well, let's focus on procurement, because that is a big issue for Eskom. We spoke to the CEO last year who said that he had to write to Treasury to buy a tool that would be used for maintenance for 70,000 Rand. He said that's how restrictive it was, the red tape. The Minister, Pravin Gordhan, spoke about the darn red tape. But we have a red tape cutter in the presidency, and could those things have been fixed?
I believe so. All of these rules and processes and regulations and the red tape we talk about are human-made. We decide, or our political decision makers decide on these processes. It's in their ability to cut it as well. If it's not unconstitutional to do this, or if it doesn't have such far-reaching implications that it's unlawful according to the laws of South Africa, then surely we can do it. We don't need new regulations to bypass regulations. We can just change the regulations. And we know this is such a national crisis that none of the opposition parties will fairly go against if it's a fair decision that the government wants to make. I can't see that to be a problem, either if it's something that's going to go through Parliament or that it goes through the normal state system. We can do it. The question is just how much political will do we have? And I must say the irony behind using a state of disaster to fix your mess is just laughable.
All right, thank you. Let's leave it there. From the Northwest University's African Centre for Disaster Studies, the head, Professor Dewald van Niekerk.